One of the interesting things about being a Sega Saturn owner back in the day was getting games that were multi-platform. Sometimes you'd get a title that may not be quite as pretty as the PlayStation counterpart, yet it was still fun to play and a great experience. Then there was stuff that just immediately fell into the garbage category and made the hardware look bad. Games that looked like crap, ran like crap, and maybe even had various modes and features stripped away. It was kinda like a game of craps. Sometimes the dice rolled your way, and sometimes it just wasn't your day. Among these multi-platform releases was the category of licensed games, or what was basically a property from another form of media, such as movies, comic books, or even a TV series. These games were often less than stellar themselves, and churned out with minimal effort to cash in on the license. Perhaps one of the stranger releases to fall into this topic was 1996's Skeleton Warriors. This 1994 cartoon, toy line, and comic book was extremely short-lived. It only ran for 13 episodes on TV, and the toys were gone shortly thereafter. So when it showed up for the Saturn and PlayStation almost 2 years later, you can imagine my surprise. In this episode, we will be looking at Skeleton Warriors for the Sega Saturn, and find out whether it's worth your time or not. This one was developed by Neversoft, the developer who would go on to do games like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater and some of the Guitar Hero games. This was their very first title and the only one they developed for the Sega Saturn. The Skeleton Warriors TV show was created by Gary Goddard, the guy that directed the 1987 film version of Masters of the Universe. The story revolves around two factions fighting for the Lightstar Crystal, an immense power source that's capable of granting its bearer control of the planet. During their initial struggle, the Lightstar was broken into two pieces, one controlled by the evil Baron Dark and the other by the righteous Prince Lightstar. The destruction of the crystal's original form corrupted Baron Dark's form into an undead skeleton, who also has the ability to turn other people into his undead minions. And so the story begins. The gameplay here is of the action side-scrolling 2.5D variety, or to sum it up a bit simply, it's a hack and slash game. You have multiple ways to attack: a basic standing attack that can be aimed upwards, a downward thrusting move that allows you to bounce on your enemies as you damage them, as well as a few different projectiles. These projectile-based attacks rely on heartstones that are dropped by enemies when they die. Should you not pick up the heartstone in time, the destroyed enemies can regenerate and continue their attack. Double tapping the left and right direction also allows you to run. Rounding out the moveset is a block for the harder enemies and the ability to grab onto platforms to gain access to higher areas. Stages scroll left to right and combine 3D elements to give the illusion of depth. Enemies constantly barrage you with both melee and ranged attacks, often popping up out of every direction to score cheap hits. Aside from dropping heartstone ammunition for your projectiles, they also frequently drop life replenishment. Every so often, you'll also encounter a third-person rocket bike level that uses a polygon engine and scrolls forward. Here you blast your way through enemy vehicles with a rapid-fire gun and heat-seeking missiles. These stages are short and have the same items to collect as the side-scrolling portions. The visuals of Skeleton Warriors are pretty good. They use a combination of pre-rendered sprites against both 2D and 3D backdrops. The sprites are very well animated and the scrolling is buttery smooth. There's a fair bit of variety in the stages as well. You get to do battle in caves, snowstorms, enemy bases, bridges, and a few other places to change up the atmosphere a bit. You get cool touches like enemies in the background throwing attacks at you, transparent fog in the foreground, and some really cool line scrolling in places that really jazz up the background detail. Sprites are large and the engine can take a ton of them without a bit of slowdown. Destroying the bad guys results in pieces of their bodies being strewn all over the place. a nice if somewhat distracting addition. The overall presentation is rather dark across the entire game, no matter the stage, which often results in smaller enemies like bats getting lost if you're moving fast. I'm typically not a fan of pre-rendered graphics, but here it's actually pretty nice looking. The color is really good and doesn't have the usual dithering associated with the style. Most of you will likely come away pretty happy with the way it looks and performs. This section is usually where I mouth off a bit about the sound and music. No need for that with Skeleton Warriors. Tommy freaking Tallarico was on the team, and that's all you need to know. The major problem that dogs Skeleton Warriors is that it takes far too long to give you any real variety in its gameplay. For well over half the game you spend the majority of your time just hacking away at enemies and little else. These enemies are not placed to provide any real challenge, and often just quickly pop onto the screen and score really cheap damage. You think that this would make things really hard, but it doesn't. The developers knew this was cheap, so they just cranked up the amount of health that gets dropped to compensate. This basically results in just barreling through these early stages with really no strategy. Just kill everything, collect the life, and move on. There's no well-designed platforming to overcome, no major obstacles to deal with, and no real use for your secondary weapons or that block button. Your projectile attacks are particularly useless early on because they use so much ammo to kill the regular bad guys. The more powerful options use even more. You can quickly run through an entire stock of Heartstones in mere seconds. By the time you do encounter some of the better moments of Skeleton Warriors, you are well deep into the game and it's almost over. Most of you will never make it that far because once the boredom sets in, you'll hit the power button and never play it again. That's actually a shame because once Skeleton Warriors does get things going, you see some real potential in it. Stages start to have you do some real platforming, using your block more, and even using platforms to climb across maze-like design. But even these stages are over before you know it, and you're sitting at the last boss with the entire thing almost completed. The worst of the gameplay definitely comes in the form of the rocket bike levels, however. These barren and awful looking additions are here for fluff and little else. They all look the same except for some palette changes and offer no real variation in enemies, purpose, or challenge. Once you see the first one, you've seen them all. For those of you interested, the PlayStation version is largely identical in terms of stage design, music, and gameplay, but suffers some major cutbacks in visuals. You lose environment effects like fog and snow, you have less parallax scrolling, and an overall feeling of emptiness to the stages. There's some slowdown here that wasn't in the Saturn game, and the image is softer as well. It was a rare time when a Saturn multi-platform release thoroughly beat the pants off the PlayStation version visually. I remember the very first time I saw Skeleton Warriors. It was in a Game Fan magazine and they went on and on about how great it looked and how awesome the gameplay was. I was so looking forward to it when it finally released. I mean, the Saturn was supposedly made for this kind of stuff. How could it not be something special? As it turns out, this was originally meant to be a 16-bit Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo release. It was decided mid-development that it would be better to take advantage of the 32-bit machines, and I definitely think that had an effect on its overall quality. The early stages are your usual run-of-the-mill hack-and-slash gameplay that was commonplace during the 4th generation of consoles. The later levels that show some real sparks of creativity were developed later, creating what is essentially 2 games of differing quality. And that's what I leave you with in this review. Skeleton Warriors has more challenge, more variety, and more things to do in the later game, so if you can last that long, you may come away liking it quite a bit. If you get bogged down in the early stages and grow weary of bashing the same enemies and simply walking left to right, you'll probably come away quite disappointed. Of course, if you were a kid back when this came out, you likely loved it because it looked so good and was so easy to get into. Overall, I feel it's a decent game for fans of this type of gameplay, bordering on a good game if you can last to the second half. If you are finding the early stages just too much of a slog, try cranking up the difficulty a bit, as this may help slow down the gameplay and require you to pay closer attention to how you deal with the enemies. While it doesn't suffer quite as much as many of the other licensed games of the era, I wouldn't call it a Saturn classic, nor would I say it's completely forgettable. It's one of those middle-of-the-road titles that often falls into the love it or hate it categories. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.